Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things with Chris James, broadcasting from the auxiliary radio station for Arkanasa Radio in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Now remember, April is right around the corner, and there's a few changes that I must mention. The Edinburgh Out of This World UFO Festival and Conference will be April 8th, 9th, and 10th. Thursday night will be the open mic in the open air. It is not being held in the auditorium, but it will be across the street in an open area where there will be tables set up so you can distance yourself from anybody you don't want to be close to. It will begin at 6 o'clock in the evening and run until 8 o'clock. Show up if you've got an interesting story you'd like to tell or you just want to hear other people tell theirs. The next night, Friday, will be the festival. It begins at 5 p.m. and it will run until 10 p.m. It will be held at the Edinburgh City Hall courtyard. Now, the big change is the conference is going to be on Saturday. It begins at 5 p.m. and runs until 10 p.m. That's right, it's all going to be held in the evening because it's outside and they don't want anybody collapsing from the heat. The conference will be Saturday, April 10th at the Edinburgh Ebony Hills Golf Course, 300 West Palm Drive in Edinburgh. And like I said, it is beginning at 5 p.m. and running until 10 p.m. It will be held outside, so bring some sunscreen if you think you might need it. Don't show up in the morning unless you intend on sitting there all day. That's at 5 p.m. at the Edinburgh Ebony Hills Golf Course. Tickets are available at the Dustin Michael Secular Memorial Library and online at edinburghufo2021.eventbrite.com. Don't wait till the last second to buy your tickets. They might sell out. I've already got mine. Instead of spending your money at some huge company trying to support your local small businesses, how about? Here in Laredo, we have the Phoenix Bookstore, 1602 Victoria Street. If you aren't in Laredo or you can't get there, try looking them up at bookshop.org/shop/the Phoenix Bookstore. Just don't pay any attention to my author's description. I am not a professor, and I've never been to the University of Bath. Trying to get that author's biography switched. They must have me confused with somebody else. Somebody a lot smarter, maybe. Tonight's show was suggested by Unknown Gamer. He contacted me asking if I knew anything about the Russian sleep experiments. The first article I found said the whole thing was nothing but a creepypasta story. So many legends are claimed as being creations on websites, you'd think that nothing is real today. To make matters worse, some folks have written off many real creatures thinking the naysayers are all telling the truth. The rake is one such story. I've seen what I really believed was a rake. I've talked to several people who described a creature that sounded exactly like what I had seen, and several of them said it was in about the same area. I run into sites that claim to be the origins of legends so often while researching that I tend to ignore them today. Here is the story according to several different people, several different websites, and several different books that I've managed to look up. Sometime back around the end of World War II, Russian scientists wanted to see if there was any way of expanding on what the Germans had done during the war. As the Nazis took control of Germany, they began looking for any way of conquering Europe. Better tanks, better aircraft, even better soldiers. Any army can only function for so long. After a while, the troops have to stop and sleep. This adds some logistics to any war plans. You need a safe place to stop, eat, and sleep. During this downtime, just about the entire line of advance has to stop, and you get to spread out and it gets messy. This gives the other guys a chance to regroup and then attack. You lose the advantage as soon as you stop moving forward. In the 1930s, doping agents such as benzodrine were used widely in Germany. At the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, many athletes performed to impossible levels, not because of advanced training, but because of drugs. German scientists developed performance-enhancing drugs such as Pervetine, a methamphetamine that produced a superior boost. Even though the Nazis stigmatized drug takers as degenerates, often incarcerating them in jails or prison, it wasn't long before the Nazis began to consider better living through pharmacology. Developed by the Temmler Pharmaceutical Company based in Berlin, Pervetine was introduced in 1938 and marketed as a magic pill for alertness and an antidepressant as well. It was even available over the counter without a prescription. A military doctor, Otto Rank, experimented with Pervetine on 90 college students, and based on his results, he announced the drug would help Germany win the war. Using Pervetine, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht could stay awake for days at a time and march many more miles without having to sleep. There are a lot of things you can do while still on the move. You can eat while traveling. Sleeping doesn't work that well. Ever fall asleep in the passenger seat of a car? Yes, you're asleep, but when you arrive at your destination, you're still tired. By having an army that didn't need to sleep, the Nazis increased their fighting ability. By doping the soldiers, they also enhanced their ability to think on their feet, and it decreased their need for food. When Germany invaded Poland, England and France declared war on them. Troops were sent to stop the Nazi advances. At the end of World War I, most countries got on with living their lives, and the armies just kind of stagnated. Germany started planning World War II while everybody else did nothing. The war to end all wars could never happen again. The so-called Stimulant Decree, issued in April 1940, sent more than 35 million tablets of Pervetine and isophane tablets to the front lines, where they fueled the Nazi blitzkrieg invasion of France. The German army advanced so quickly through Belgium and France that the British troops were surrounded with their backs against the Channel, with no way of escaping. The retreat had been mismanaged, and the troops found themselves with little equipment and no food. British, French, Canadian, and Belgian troops had been forced back to Dunkirk by the advancing German army. Nearly every escape route to the English Channel had been cut off, and a terrible disaster was on the horizon. The German army, I said it again. The German army simply had to waltz in and destroy the British army. This would have left England with little to defend themselves. It looked as if the war in Europe was over. The German army stopped advancing. Instead of continuing on the attack, they stopped and sat there, not doing anything. Now, a few folks will say this was because Hitler had decided to halt his troops for some unknown and unreasonable reason. The reason I find most believable was that suddenly the German soldiers were no longer able to advance. All the drugs being handed out like candy on Halloween suddenly stopped working. The men were in a stupor, unable to perform simple tasks, let alone any kind of military maneuvers. The leaders reasoned any further fighting would lead to the loss of a substantial amount of their troops. The drugs were no longer doing what they were supposed to do. For days, the Germans sat and did nothing, while England sent thousands of boats across the Channel to save their men. Prime Minister Winston Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. Well over 330,000 Allied troops were eventually rescued, giving England the ability to stand against Germany. From 1941, the Reich knew that Pervetine had some nasty side effects and a high risk of addiction. Even when soldiers were dying because of heart failure or committing suicide due to psychotic phases, methamphetamines continued to fuel the country until the very end of the war. It wasn't just troops fighting in the field who used drugs. It was common for political leaders and industrialists to use drugs, thinking they gave them an edge or they improved their natural abilities. Drug users were degenerates unless they were in the right circles. If you go back and study the history of drugs, it is fascinating and disturbing at the same time. 1874, an English researcher, C.R. Wright, synthesized a drug by boiling morphine and acetic anhydride. His new drug was known as diacetylmorphine. It showed some undesirable side effects, such as anxiety, sleeplessness, vomiting, and other bad things that nobody really wanted. He discontinued his research. In 1895, German scientist Heinrich Dresser and his colleagues at the pharmaceutical company Bayer continued Wright's studies and declared diacetylmorphine successful in treating many common respiratory ailments. Bayer began manufacturing diacetylmorphine and marketing it under the name heroin. It was then widely distributed and available in over-the-counter form. Heroin was used to treat everything from breathing problems to teething. Lots of little kids were being given heroin to make them stop crying. It wasn't until 1924 that laws came about making the use of heroin and the manufacture and distribution illegal. Many historians today consider the initial success of the Nazi invasion as being a direct result of the troops using drugs to stay awake and alert. The Blitzkrieg was fueled by speed. As the war continued, many armies from all over the world began to see the strategic use of drugs. By making their men more alert for longer periods of time, they could win more battles. Germans were not alone in their use of performance-enhancing drugs during World War II. Allied soldiers were known to use methamphetamines, aka speed, in the form of benzodrine in order to battle combat fatigue. As men pushed themselves harder and longer, the effects of not sleeping began to show up all over the place. Some thought this was due to the drugs, while others thought it was due to not sleeping. As the Nazis began to flee Europe and those left behind found themselves about to face the music, Scientists who had helped develop the tools of war began to surrender to either the Allies or the Russians. Stalin was a very paranoid guy. He was known to kill off anyone he saw as becoming a threat, even if it only looked that way. He also wanted to be in a position to win the next war should one pop up in the future. As German scientists found themselves surrendering to the Russians, they wanted to show how important they were so they wouldn't wind up as the main guest in a firing squad or wind up visiting some gulag. The Russians took note of everything these men had to offer. When the Blitz was being examined, the Russian leaders wanted to know how they could get their troops to fight in such a fast and devastating manner. The idea of sleep began to show up. Would it be possible to create a soldier, either through training or drug use, that could fight for days, weeks, or even months without the need of sleep? Russia had an overabundance of prisoners. There were somewhere around 3 million German soldiers captured by the Russians. Prisoners had to be fed and housed, and somebody had to keep an eye on them. With so many possible test subjects, it didn't take long for someone to decide, let's see what we can do. Sometime in the late 1940s, a group of volunteers were taken to a secret facility with promises of freedom upon completion of their coming tests. The test lab was set up with several rooms, all accessible to the subjects but observable by the scientists. The test subjects were to be kept isolated from the outside world. They had food to keep them going for weeks and some books to read if they wanted entertainment. The test was scheduled to last 30 days. Security was tight, so only the men doing the research had access to the lab. The story showing up the most says there were 5 or 6 men subjected to sleeplessness. A gas was being used as a stimulant to keep the men awake. If this test was successful, the gas would be given to the Russian military. If it went bust, then the bodies would disappear and some more volunteers would be forced into service. The test went well for the first few days. The men in the lab were able to perform their assigned tasks with minimal problems. It was on or around the 4th or 5th days that things began to get interesting. The men were in an isolated bunch of rooms with cameras and microphones, so the guys in the white lab coats could observe them at all times. One report I found said there were no video cameras available, so the scientists had small windows put in with thick glass so the test subjects could be seen, but they couldn't look back out. If 1 or 2 of the lab rats showed signs of falling asleep, the gas would be turned up or some sound would be generated to wake them up. Around the 5th day, the test subjects began discussing the war they had been through and the horrors they had witnessed. In wartime, people do things that in peacetime would be abhorrent. Whether these were German prisoners or Russian prisoners, they would have had similar experiences. The men talked about seeing things that visited them in their waking dreams. At either day 6 or 7, the men began showing signs of psychosis, talking to themselves and talking to things that weren't there. They began to grow paranoid of each other, and they would whisper into the microphones, telling the stories about the other subjects. The researchers were all aware of the symptoms of sleep deprivation. Noting that after 5 days without sleep, the mind can begin to experience realistic hallucinations as if it's turning against the person that is fighting sleep. The researchers debated whether these signs of mental imbalance were because of a lack of sleep, or was it the drugs being pumped into the lab day and night. One of the test subjects began to scream and run from room to room. The other subjects all did their best to ignore him. He screamed and he flailed his arms around as if fighting off unseen attackers. After nearly a day of non-stop screaming, the guy's voice gave out on him. He continued running around making a kind of a squeaking sound. The guys studying the lab rats discovered the cameras had all been disabled or the windows were covered in some unknown substance, making observing the test subjects impossible. They tried contacting the lab rats by microphone, but the test subjects didn't answer. As they listened, the lab coats couldn't hear any sounds from the lab. The man in charge decided it was time to go see what was up. The guy in charge announced that all the test subjects were to lie flat on the floor so the researchers could examine some of the equipment used to monitor the lab. There was no response from the test subjects. The gas was turned off and the room flooded with clean air. This elicited a scream from somewhere in the lab. One of the test subjects yelled to turn the gas back on. He said none of them wanted to go free. They just wanted the gas. The guy in charge tried to reason with the man speaking, but all he did was scream or plead for the gas to be turned back on. Once the gas had been cleared, the door was unlocked, and the scientists, accompanied by several guards, went to see what was going on with their test subjects. One, or it might have been two, of the lab rats were dead. Their bodies showed signs of violent attacks, and they had been bitten. There were chunks of flesh missing. Some of the injuries looked self-inflicted, while other injuries had to have been done by the other test subjects, who were still hiding in some of the other rooms. The scientists searched the lab, and they found the other lab rats hidden away in different parts of the facility. The surviving test subjects refused to acknowledge the scientists. These men all showed signs of causing injuries to themselves as well. Some had open wounds, while others were missing fingers and toes. Skin was missing from their arms and legs. A decision had to be made. Do they remove all the test subjects and destroy all their notes, or should they remove the dead bodies and continue with the remaining lab rats? In Russia, back in the 40s and 50s, it was a bad career move to make decisions on your own. The smart thing to do was push any questions up the chain of command and wait for somebody else to stick their neck out. Someone higher up the food chain announced the test was a bust. It was to be stopped, and all the test subjects were to be removed and taken away. They would probably be taken out in the woods and shot. Soldiers were sent to dismantle the lab. When they opened the lab door, the men inside attacked. There was a horrendous hand-to-hand battle. None of the soldiers were expecting anything like this, and so they weren't armed. Only the officers had weapons. During the fight, a few of the Russian soldiers lost their lives. Others were so traumatized they had to be locked away in hospitals. The entire episode was swept under the rug. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union that hundreds of KGB officers found themselves in need of work. This led to thousands of pages of secret documents being released to anyone that had a few bucks to buy them. In another version of the final days of the sleep experiment, the remaining live test subjects were taken to a hospital to see if they could be salvaged. I find this odd, since the folks in charge had thousands of new lab rats to use. Why go through the effort of saving these men only to try using them again? The story goes that the test subjects were taken away and the gas was given to them once more, only this time they were strapped down to tables and studied more intensely. One subject began showing bizarre EKG rhythms. The first EKG device had been invented in 1895. The patients strapped down to the table showed what looked like very violent and dangerous brain waves. The scientists all agreed this was not the beginning of something they couldn't keep under control, and so the remaining lab rats were all killed. The entire test was blamed on the KGB. Seeing as the first experiments were conducted in the late 40s, the KGB could not have been involved, not yet anyway. Some naysayers will yell, "This is the whole thing that proves it's a hoax because the KGB didn't exist yet." This is one of their favorite arguments. The origins of the KGB go all the way back to the reign of Tsar Nicholas II, when, in 1881, a secret police force known as the Okhrana were developed. After the revolution in 1917 and during the first days of the Bolshevik government, Vladimir Lenin transformed the remains of the Okhrana into an organization called the Cheka in order to consolidate his power. The organization was not created from scratch, but rather it inherited much of the techniques, personnel, and political orientation from the greatly feared agency that had preceded it. The so-called Russian Revolution wasn't really a revolution. According to the communists, a revolution is the class struggle which expects to lead to political change, which is expected to lead to political change, and the triumph of communism. The Russian Revolution was actually the political coup supported by the military overthrow of the ruling class and the establishment of a dictatorship. But that's the subject for another show, maybe. During World War II, and immediately after the Cheka, would have been the ones initiating the sleep experiments. Like any bad idea, the experiments would have gone on as long as somebody up in the power chain thought it might bring about a military advantage over the West. In 1954, when the KGB took over from the Cheka, the continuation of the experiments would have fallen under their control. Can a person go too long without sleep? There are some folks who have tried to see if it was possible. Peter Tripp was a top 40s countdown radio personality from the mid-1950s whose career peaked in 1959, record-breaking 201-hour wake-a-thon. This was a term coined by working on the radio non-stop without sleep to benefit the March of Dimes. For much of the stunt, Tripp sat in a glass booth in Times Square so people could come by and see him. After a few days, he began to hallucinate. For the last 66 hours, the scientists and doctors were giving him drugs to help him stay awake. He was broadcasting for WMGM in New York City at the time. Tripp suffered psychologically. After the stunt, he began to think he was an imposter of himself, and this continued for some time. His career soon suffered a massive downturn when he was involved in the payola scandal of 1960. Like several other disc jockeys, he had been playing particular records in return for gifts from record companies. If a record company had an artist they thought could make them millions of dollars, they would pay disc jockeys to play the record as much as possible, saying this is what the listening audience wanted to hear. Tripp had accepted $36,050 in bribes. Despite his claims that he never took a dime from anyone, he was found guilty on a charge of commercial bribery, and he received a $500 fine and 6-month suspended sentence. Even his Wake-a-thon record did not endure for long. Other DJs had quickly attempted to beat it. 6 years after Tripp's record, it was smashed by a high school student named Randy Gardner, who lasted for 11 days. And with that, I'm going to take a brief pause and play a couple commercials. Don't go away, we'll be right back after this. If your house is infested by ghosts, maybe it's time to contact somebody that can help you. Call the Laredo Paranormal Research Society and they'll come by and see if they can't do something about your uninvited guests. You can contact the LPRS at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. It's a bird. It's a plane. I need to get my eyes checked. Where am I going to get my eyes checked? Why, at Optica del Norte, 107 Calle del Norte, right across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Why would anybody go through life drinking bad coffee? It's like a disgrace. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, the best coffee on the planet. You can find them at 4501 McPherson. Or, if you don't live in Laredo, you can order at organicmancoffeetrike.shop. The absolute best coffee on the planet. It's time to take better care of your skin. After all, it is the biggest organ in your body. Contact Lourdes James at 956-723-3019. Talk to her about a free skincare consultation. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And now, back to the show. Randy Gardner was born 1946. December 1963 to January 64, a 17-year-old Gardner stayed awake for 11 days and 25 minutes. That's 264.4 hours, breaking the previous record of 260 hours held by Tom Rounds. Gardner's record-setting stint was attended by Stanford sleep researcher Dr. William C. Dement, while his health was monitored by Lieutenant Commander John J. Ross. A log was kept by two of Gardner's classmates from Point Loma High School, Bruce McAllister and Joe Macarino, Jr. According to Gardner's sleep deprivation experience and medical response became widely known among the sleep research community. Dr. Dement said that Gardner's experiment demonstrated that extreme sleep deprivation has little effect other than the mood changes associated with tiredness. However, Lieutenant Commander John Ross reported serious cognitive and behavioral changes. These included moodiness, problems with concentration, short-term memory, paranoia, and hallucinations. On the 11th day, when he was asked to subtract 7 repeatedly, starting with 100, he stopped at 65. When asked why he had stopped, he replied that he forgot what he was doing. Gardner's record was broken a month later by Tomi Soni in Hamina, Finland, who stayed awake for 11 and a half days. The Guinness Book of World Records says that Maureen Weston stayed awake for 449 hours in the United Kingdom. They no longer have sleep deprivation as a world's record, so if you're thinking about trying to do it, don't bother. You won't be recorded. One thing nobody looked into was the interaction of one person staying awake with a support group of somebody telling them that they're doing okay or talking them down when they started getting too paranoid. One person being coached or supported by several friendly people would have an outlet for hostile or paranoid thoughts. Somebody to talk them down, as it were. By putting a group of prisoners together with only each other to talk to might have the opposite effect. Instead of talking to each other and getting them through the rough spots, they may have fed on each other's bad ideas, developing even more bizarre thoughts. What really gets me to think that the KGB was actually working on sleep experiments is because the CIA was doing it. During the 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency embarked on a top-secret program meant to find drugs, tools, and techniques for mind control. The CIA spent a whopping 20 years conducting more than 150 experiments. These experiments, which are collectively referred to as MK-Ultra, include slipping LSD to unsuspecting bargoers, testing various electric shock techniques, tricking heroin addicts into taking a variety of hallucinogens, and using sleep deprivation in an attempt to brainwash. They would have looked at the research done by the Nazis during World War II and then taken it from there. As far as we know, such government testing has stopped, and more than 20,000 pages of documentation on MKUltra was released to the public in 1977. Then again, we have only their word for it, saying they don't do nasty things anymore. All those documents released to the public are only the files that didn't put a lot of undesirable attention on the agency. Lots of files were burned, but those who had something to hide. Lots of files are still hidden away under the guise of national security. How do we know the CIA isn't conducting sleep experiments on unwilling or unknowing lab rats right now? In 2005, the CIA admitted to authorizing up to 180 hours of continuous sleep deprivation during interrogations. That's over a week without sleep. The idea is to get people to no longer have the ability to know what they should or shouldn't say. Also, by waving the carrot of being allowed to sleep if they'll just answer a few questions, can have a powerful effect on someone's thought process. In 2014, the United Nations criticized the United States for continuing to use sleep deprivation as a form of torture, despite banning other controversial techniques such as waterboarding. Funny how they condemned the U.S., but they didn't say anything to China or Russia or the Middle East about their unsavory prisoner treatment. The UN know the United States won't eject them from our country, so they have no qualms about poking a stick in our side. Other countries they avoid angering, knowing there would be harsh consequences in saying anything to them. The United States is by no means the only country to have engaged in this kind of torture. Interestingly, a New York Times article reported that the United States military adopted the technique after training their own people to cope with Soviet-style torture. In April 1953, Allen Dulles took the reins of the CIA. He was the first civilian head of the agency. The CIA's charter said they could only function in foreign countries and they were answerable to the president. Well, that didn't last very long. Dulles spoke at a Princeton alumni gathering where he went into some detail on the Korean War and its aftermath. Prisoners were being released from North Korea and coming home with all manner of bizarre mental problems. Some of these men were spouting communist propaganda as if they had been transformed from good U.S. GIs into little commie animations. None of these men had any kind of un-American sentiment until they were taken prisoner by the North. Now these men were claiming the United States had used chemical and germ weapons against the North Koreans. They said the U.S. was wrong in fighting the soldiers from the North, and they should have either gone home or joined the enemy. Dulles said it looked as if these men had been converted to communism by means of brainwashing. Some prisoners even refused to return to the United States, publicly stating they would much rather stay in North Korea. At the time of his statement, the CIA was about to sponsor the overthrow of a democratically elected leader in Iran to put a puppet dictator in place. While Allen Dulles was the head of the CIA, his brother John was the Secretary of State. Between them, they decided what the world should look like, and then they used their connections to change anything they didn't like. The CIA would come up with a story saying some foreign leader was going to become a communist, and the Secretary of State would convince the president it was in our best interests to put money and arms into a country to have that leader removed. It didn't matter if this person was elected or not. It was what the Dulles brothers thought was best that was implemented. I wonder how many lives were lost in these manufactured coups. How many people were forced out of their homes and their lives destroyed so these two men could have what they wanted. A lot of these so-called communist regimes were trying to nationalize their countries, like what happened with the United Fruit Company in March of 1951. Jacobo Arbenz Guzmin came to power in Guatemala in what was touted to be the second ever universal suffrage election for the small nation and the first peaceful transition of power in their history. His campaign promises included making Guatemala economically independent, and he wanted to extend voting and labor rights. Guzmin published the Decree 900, which was a law that would expatriate uncultivated land belonging to large plantations and transfer it to the people for their use. Guzmin promises were seen as threats by the elite population and by those that controlled foreign business interests like the United Fruit Company. Guzmin's promises were also seen as a threat to American interests by the Eisenhower administration. It also didn't help that Guzmin seemed to have tolerance and sympathy with the Guatemalan Labor Party. So, the CIA initiated a coup and Guzmin was forced to flee the country. The United Fruit Company continued selling bananas, making a lot of money for the elites as well as the CIA. A search of all the documents at the capital of Guatemala found no evidence of any communist connections to Guzmin. The lasting aftermath of this maneuver was the term Banana Republic. Dulles had just become the first civilian director of an agency growing more powerful by the day, and the speech provided an early glimpse into his priorities for the CIA. He said, "In the past few years we have become accustomed to hearing much about the battle for men's minds, the war of ideology. I wonder, however, whether we clearly perceive the magnitude of the problem, whether we realize how sinister the battle for men's minds has become in the Soviet hands. We might call it, in its new form, brain warfare. In order to understand how the communists were able to brainwash someone, the CIA decided to experiment on how brainwashing was done. This isn't something you can just read a book on and come to a conclusion. People were needed to experiment on. Lab rats. One quick way of getting lots of lab rats was by using the military. The trouble with using soldiers is there's lots of them who will remember what happened and who did it. Soldiers are going to leave the military someday, and they just might object to anything really bad having been done to them. Plus, you don't want to mess up the guys who just might be needed to fight the next war. There was a ready supply of lab rats that even if they did tell people what the weird experiments being done on them, nobody would believe them. Psychiatric patients. Scientists working for the CIA were asked to figure out how to brainwash someone. They were given bags full of cash and told, "Get her done." Some scientists went with the idea of keeping the lab rats awake for days to see if they could convince them into changing their thought process. Others used drugs. Then the idea of using drugs and sleep deprivation was used. The MKUltra program was created by Sidney Gottlieb in 1953. He ran it until it was shut down in the early 60s. Gottlieb was also the CIA's chief chemist, creating poisons and innovative ways of surreptitiously administering them. He was the head of the CIA's program that created high-tech gadgets for spies to use. He was their Q. MKUltra was a project lasting up to 10 years in which the CIA sought to find ways to control the human mind. They wanted to be able to have a truth serum that would make prisoners tell everything they knew, combined with an amnesiac that would make people forget what they had done. So once a person had spilled the beans, they forgot that they had done so. One of the most important wishes was a technique or a drug that would allow the CIA to direct agents to carry out acts like sabotage and assassination and then forget who had ordered them to do it. This would lead to people committing all manners of crimes and then not know why they did them or that they even did anything they were being accused of. People like, maybe Lee Harvey Oswald. 3 days after his speech decrying the evil things being done by the Soviets, Dulles approved of the beginning of MKUltra, the top-secret CIA program for covert use of biological and chemical materials. American values made for good rhetoric, but Dulles had far grander plans for the agency's Cold War agenda. MKUltra's mind control experiments generally centered around behavior modification using electroshock therapy, hypnosis, radiation, and sleep deprivation, as well as all kinds of drugs, toxins, and chemicals. These experiments relied on a range of test subjects, some who actually volunteered, some who volunteered thinking that they were getting into something other than what they were actually getting into, many who were coerced into joining or volunteering, and some who had absolutely no idea what was going on. They were simply being experimented on. From mentally impaired boys at a state school, of folks locked in mental hospitals, as well as sexual psychopaths in state hospitals, MKUltra's program often preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. The CIA considered prisoners especially good subjects as they were willing to give consent in exchange for extra recreation time or for commuting their sentences. Whitey Bulger, a former organized crime boss, said he was given LSD by the CIA while serving a prison sentence in the 50s. He said 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state. A Bulger was in Atlanta Penitentiary in 1957, where he said he was experimented on. He said he experienced a total lack of appetite, hallucinations. The room would change shapes. There were hours of paranoia and feelings of violence. He said we experienced horrible periods of living nightmares, and we saw blood coming out of the walls. Guys turned into skeletons right in front of me. He said he saw a camera change into the head of a dog. He said he felt like he was going insane. A Bulger claimed he'd been injected with LSD, lysergic diethylmethylide. That's a long word, diethylamide, or acid, and became one of the CIA's key interests for its brain warfare program, as the agency theorized it could be useful in interrogation. In the late 40s, the CIA received reports that the Soviet Union had engaged in intensive efforts to produce LSD, and that the Soviets had attempted to purchase the world's supply of the chemical. One CIA officer described the agency as literally terrified of the Soviets' LSD program, largely because of a lack of knowledge about the drug in the United States. This was the one material that we had ever been able to locate that really had potential fantastic possibilities if used wrongly, the officer said. With the advent of MKUltra, the government's interest in LSD shifted from a defensive weapon to an offensive. Agency officials listed the LSD could be potentially useful in gaining control of bodies, whether they were willing or not. The CIA envisioned applications that ranged from removing people from Europe in the case of a Soviet attack to enabling assassination of enemy leaders. On November 18, 1953, a group of 10 scientists met at a cabin located deep in the forest of Maryland. After extended discussion, the participants agreed that to truly understand the value of the drug, an unwitting experiment would be desirable. The CIA remained keenly aware of how the public would react to any discovery of MKUltra, even if they believed these programs to be essential to national security. They must remain a tightly guarded secret. How would the CIA possibly explain dosing unassuming Americans with LSD? Precautions must be taken, and not only to protect operations from exposure to enemy forces, but also to conceal these activities from the American public in general, wrote the CIA's Inspector General in 1957. The knowledge that the agency is engaged in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions in political and diplomatic circles, and would be determined to be accomplishments of its mission. The CIA initially experimented with LSD were fairly simple, if shockingly unethical. The agency generally dosed single targets, finding volunteers when they could, and sometimes slipping the drug into drinks of fellow CIA employees. Over time, these LSD experiments grew increasingly elaborate. The KGB would have found out about the CIA's experiments with drugs and sleep deprivation, so they would have put more effort into their experiments. It's kind of like having the tallest building on the planet. You have bragging rights for a few days until somebody else adds a few feet to their building, and then you're back to trying to outdo them. Between Russia and the U.S., sleep experiments were being conducted. How far should an experiment be taken? When you test a new product, it is usually taken to the point of failure. Cars are crashed to see how well they keep the occupants alive. Planes are crashed to see how bad things will get when things go wrong. People will be kept awake until they break. Once a person's mind breaks, how do you go about putting it back together? The KGB and the CIA would simply say, "That's not our problem." The KGB would have had a far more ability to conduct bizarre experiments and keep them secret, especially in the 50s and 60s. Those conducting these experiments would have known if the truth ever came out, there would be some people who objected to human test subjects being treated like animals. In 1973, amid a government-wide panic caused by Watergate, a CIA director, Richard Helms, ordered all MKUltra files be destroyed. Just slightly illegal. Pursuant to this order, most CIA documents regarding the projects were destroyed, making an investigation of MKUltra impossible. However, a catch of 20,000 documents survived Helms' purge because they were incorrectly stored in a financial records building and were discovered by a FOIA request in 1977. These documents were fully investigated during the Senate hearings. After World War II, a series of trials were held of the members of the Nazi Party responsible for a multitude of war crimes. The trials had been approved by President Truman on May 2, 1945, and they were led by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. They began on November 20, 1945, in Nuremberg, Germany, in what became known as the Nuremberg Trials. In one of the trials, it became known as the Doctor's Trial. German physicians responsible for conducting unethical medical procedures on humans during the war were tried. They focused on physicians who conducted inhumane and unethical human experiments in concentration camps, in addition to those who were involved in over 3 million sterilizations of German citizens. The Nuremberg Code, which stated explicit voluntary consent from patients are required for human experimentation, was drafted August 9, 1947. The Nuremberg Code has not been officially accepted as law by any nation or as official ethics guideline for any association. I have no proof the Russian sleep experiments ever took place. The paperwork was all either destroyed or is still sitting in some vault somewhere. The CIA destroyed most of their files with the exception of those that had been placed in the wrong files. Knowing Germany was able to march across Europe during the Blitz because their soldiers didn't need sleep is a fact. Knowing German scientists were captured at the end of the war is also well known. Russia and the Allies would have wanted to have the upper hand in the event of a Cold War turning hot. They knew the advantages of having soldiers who could go long periods of time without having to sleep. The only way to find these answers was to experiment, and experiment on humans. Whether these humans volunteered is one thing. They had no way of knowing what the experiments would entail. The biggest mistake volunteers make is believing the government is telling the truth. A lack of sleep won't make you crazy. Combine a lack of sleep with some unknown drug and anything is possible. Putting someone in charge of the whole thing who has no morals or scruples is destined for disastrous results. Who knows what bizarre chemical cocktails were given to people all over the world under the pretense of someone's national security. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends what they're missing. Don't forget that the UFO Conference will be the April 8th, 9th, and 10th. On the 8th, it will begin at 6 p.m. and run until 8 p.m. That's the open mic. On the 9th, that's Friday night, the festival will be from 5 o'clock till 9 o'clock in the evening. It is held at the Edinburgh City Hall courtyards. And on Saturday, the 10th of April, remember that the conference will be held at the golf course beginning 5 p.m., that's in the evening, and running until 10 at night. Don't show up too early unless you really intend on just spending the whole day waiting. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?